should have gotten rid of the U.S. flag, because Lincoln had written a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper back at the time of the Civil War, saying, look, if I can save the Union without freeing a single slave, that's what I'll do. So he wasn't really going into this conflict as a matter of we have to fight to free those slaves. In fact, the Southerners weren't doing that either. Only 7% of the South owned slaves. 93% of Southerners were dirt farmers who didn't own any slaves at all, and they weren't going to war because they loved to have slaves. They had no slaves. It was only the elite, the planter class, and they were just like the elite of the North and the elite in Europe. And what you find is in 1863, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't do that at the beginning of the war. He waited 2 years into the war because he was afraid of European intervention. And even then, it only freed the slaves in the South. The Northerners, people in New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they kept their slaves for 2 more years until December of 1865 when the 13th Amendment was passed. So if you're going to do away with any flag, you should do away with the U.S. flag. But that's not the way the situation is presented. Now, all of this is part of a long train of events of these power elites, as I call them, trying to regain control of the country. And basically, that's what it was. And so what you have in the current display of this sort of thing is the hypocrisy of the left. And when I was in the federal government, I used to point this out, and it drives them crazy. They would look at the South and say, okay, you've got the segregated schools. You got that George Wallace standing in the doorway in Alabama preventing these poor black children from receiving equal educational opportunity. And so they go into the court with Brown versus the Board of Education to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which was 1896. And so they said, no, we're going to have desegregation. And so what you had was a string of court decisions which gave us court-ordered busing, and they invariably used racial balanced busing. If you had a segregated school system, all blacks and all whites, what you would do is try and racially balance it. Let's say the population of the system was 70% white, 30% black. They would want to desegregate the schools and integrate them so that each school was 70-30. Each one had that ratio, and they said, how wonderful we are, how enlightened we are, this is great. And that's what's been going on for about 50 years. But I've been pounding them and saying, when I was testifying before Congress, I said, you people are a bunch of hypocrites. You're doing the exact opposite. And they look very indignant. Oh, no, we're wonderful. We're preserving the civil rights of minorities. And I said, no, you're not. You're violating the Civil Rights Act. And they get all upset until I explained it to them. I said, look, the Civil Rights Act in 1965 was to have the aggrieved party, minorities, blacks particularly, who are prevented from going to a particular restroom or drinking at a water fountain or, sitting at a lunch counter, from not exercising their equal rights to sit at that lunch counter if they wanted to. And that has been somewhat successful. However, you people with court-ordered busing, you're doing the opposite. You're taking black youngsters, forcing them onto school buses, transporting them across the county, whether they want to or not, to go to inferior schools in white neighborhoods. Why, for the love of Pete, if you think a desegregated school with a rotten building, a rotten teacher, and rotten textbooks, why are you keeping 30% of them in there? If it's a bad situation, why don't you allow all of them to get free transportation, go to a better school? And they just sort of stop in their tracks and start to think, which is what I want them to do, because the people today have been conditioned to have emotional responses rather than to actually think things through. So I would explain to them, nobody studies on a school bus. You're forcing these black children in disproportionate numbers to do this. You're denying them an hour of study time at least that you're not denying the white youngsters. And I said, that's not the purpose of the civil rights movement. You don't go into a black neighborhood and say, hey, I'm sorry, all of you people are eating this soul food, and we're going to take 70% of you and ship you across town to eat at a white restaurant where you don't want to be. You don't do that, so why are you doing it with the youngsters? Don't they have individual rights? What you should be doing is enforcing their choice to do what they want to.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head, because in all of this promulgation of what have come to be called rights, if you notice, the one thing everybody is losing is the right to choose and freedom to do it. And that's what the whole founding of the country was all about. Talking to Dr. Dennis Cuddy right now with this Memorial Day weekend. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler, the program.
Steel25 promo code to get
the role that elites and history, is it elites or elites? Elites, I guess. And history changes are making in how we view our politics. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Leffler here with you. Memorial Day weekend. On holidays, we always do things a little differently. Dr. Dennis Cuddy, my guest right now. Okay, we talk about elites. Now, what elites have done since the civil rights movement, the goal of the civil rights movement was to get everybody up on an equal status. That would seem to be what Martin Luther King was aiming for. But now we've created an industry, and what this industry does to keep itself propagated is to trap people within it and not let them out. And you see this, say, for example, the NEA. The head of the NEA was just recently in a speech saying that, talking about institutional racism. Well, they have opposed every meaningful kind of parental choice that would give minority parents, black parents, the opportunity to send their kids to schools that actually worked. They're a key problem of institutional racism.
Yeah, and the NAACP is right there with them. See, what you have is there's an elite among blacks or minorities as well as whites. And so, like, if you were to go to a social function, you'll probably see some well-off blacks and well-off whites. I don't think you're going to see a bunch of ditch diggers in that meeting. You will find that elite blacks get along very, very well with elite whites, but neither one of them like to associate with the poorer people. And so what you would find, for example, in the first test case, William Raspberry is noted Washington Post nationally syndicated columnist. And when I was in Washington, he and I became friends, and he wrote a long column about my proposed solution, his predominant first choice, free transportation. And he said, well, why doesn't Cuddy, as the third person, why doesn't Cuddy try this out? And so I contacted Norfolk, Virginia, as a sort of test case, and I talked to the assistant DA, and she thought this was a good idea. And so the person leading that battle was Nelson White, who was a 45-year-old black house painter, and his wife. And they're saying, what are you people pushing us around for? What are you elite blacks and whites, telling us what we can do? In the South, you used to have to sit at the back of the bus, right? And so what I'd say to them, I said, look, it's not just the back of the bus that's the problem. It's that the white power structure, liberal or conservative, doesn't matter, telling blacks where they can and can't sit. That's the problem. If there's 5 blacks and there's 5 seats at the front of the bus, why can't they all sit at the front of the bus? What business have you got, white or black elitists, telling them they got to sit in every 7 seats to racially disperse the thing? You're basically replacing the old white Southern racist segregationists with these new white liberals as the new slave masters. Neither one of you got any business doing what you're doing. And so when you put it in that sense, they sort of start to wake up. And then the second school system that tried it was the Oklahoma City, what we call the Dowell School. Tried a variation of it. And what I did is I kept records, and I showed that in Norfolk and Oklahoma, black scores went up. They went up when they tried the solution. And so my bitterest enemies were the NAACP and the NEA. I mean, they were fighting me all over the place, as well as these academic elite, until you actually came through and you showed, look who's supporting this. It's blacks themselves, not the elite blacks. They're sending their kids to these prep schools anyway, but the average black citizen, the average white citizen. And I said, look, you keep saying about how all these blacks, the poor blacks, are stupid. And I said, now, why don't we just look at the facts here? And I showed them the facts in my particular state. I said, look, we did a test preschool, like 4-year-old, 5-year-olds, when they enter schools, of blacks and whites. And when they entered school, you found that about 30% of the population of minorities were listed as gifted, even among the poor. And then I showed, as these young black students, first grade, second grade, third grade, so that percentage declined. After doing their 1 year, it's like only 20% were gifted. And then a few years later, only 10%. I see what's happening. It's not the parents. The parents are not stupid. The poor parents are not stupid. They have the best interest of their children at stake. They really want them to be educated. It's what's happening at the schools that's doing this damage to the minority population.
Yeah, and look what we've done to education as a whole, too.
Right, illiteracy and so forth. Literacy and ability to read is the key. It's the key to education. You got to get them, because after a while, if they fall behind, they start to drop out of school and so on and so on. So we did a test here, and we found there was this low-performing school, and only 25% of the California Achievement Test were able to read, at an acceptable level. Well, 9 teachers got trained in what's called the Spalding Direct Intensive Phonics Instruction. It's not a whole program. It's a very, very short matter. You can teach youngsters to read in 3-4 months. And once the teachers did that, they were amazed. They went back to the schools. We had a pre-test and a post-test, and it doubled their California Achievement Test scores. They went from like 26% up to about 51%. So we know that this can be done. It works with dyslexic students. It works with English as a second language students. The Gallego School in Tucson did this. It was only $2.61 a student to get this thing over, and their reading ability dramatically increased, and these youngsters only spoke Spanish when they started. So we know how to do this thing, but it's the NEA who is preventing, like John said, it's the the NEA is perpetuating this institutional racism, and oftentimes it's the NAACP that you have trouble with breaking through. The evidence is overwhelming. Nobody studies on a school bus. So when you see, like in my particular district where I am, 90% of the youngsters bused outside the neighborhood attendance zone are blacks. 90%. Now, when you do that, when you stick black youngsters on a bus where they can't study for an hour, deny them an hour's study time that you're not denying whites, it's no surprise that their academic achievement isn't as well as the white population. But you have to pound these people because they control the media, they control the perception, and the power elite ultimately is controlling all of these things. And that's what they want. They don't want people to think. They want people to simply have an emotional reaction. So all you have to do now is say racism, and that's supposed to shut the other person up. Or transgender phobia or something, that's supposed to shut you up. So what I try to do, just like I did with the busing issue, is I try to flip the argument and I say, okay, I'm going to flip it, I'm going to personalize it. Walk up to a person and say, would you want a 50-year-old child molesting male in a bathroom, a public bathroom or shower, alone with your 5-year-old daughter? And all of a sudden, you see the sort of the light bulb go on over their head, right? All of a sudden, they see this is not a cliche, this is not a minor thing. And then what I do is I add to that a hypocrisy level, because if the person's, let's say, a liberal, right? If they're liberal, they say, well, women have a right to abortion because it's women's right to privacy. So I'll say, don't you see that you're destroying women's right to privacy? And all of a sudden they say, whoa, so all of a sudden they start to change their mind on this.
I remember you were saying quite frequently here on the show over the last 20 years, what the power elite have sort of structured things as is that they control both groups.
Right.
That way the American public can throw one group of rascals out and put another group of rascals in.
Yeah, that's the plan.
As we noticed after 2008 and 2012, nothing changed. Is that what we're seeing in Donald Trump?
Well, there are various groups composing the power elite. There's the Cecil Rhodes group and the Rhodes Scholars. There's the Fabian Socialists. There's the Skull and Bones types and so forth. And that particular attitude originated in the Skull and Bones, which the public is basically too stupid and needs these powerful people to direct them. And we ought to be able to alternate power, just like the Whitneys say, alternate power without really changing anything, which is what they're doing. And so you have basically for the last almost 50 years this alternation of power. There was one slight exception when George H.W. Bush succeeded President Reagan, but that was a special circumstance, and then Bush went out so Clinton could come and twist enough Democrat senators' arms so you get NAFTA and GATT, which is really important to the power elite. They really wanted NAFTA and GATT.
And you can see the same elitist groups, Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, everybody having apoplectic fits over the Brexit vote in Great Britain, which is coming up because that's threatening their ideal of where they're going.
So what you had in this case was an election where you had so many people that Donald Trump, with only I think it was about 38% of the vote, could pull off a victory. 62% of Republicans voted against Trump. But if you have enough people in the field, same thing with Mitt Romney last time. Mitt Romney only got about 42% at any time. But there were about 7 or 8 people in the field, so there were so many people in the field so that he wins the nomination with a plurality rather than a majority. So Bernie Sanders, for example. Bernie Sanders represents the power elite's psychological probe of the millennials. They wanted Bernie in there to show if they had successfully persuaded enough of the younger people, millennials, to have an emotional reaction, emotional connection to Bernie's concept of a revolution and be able to accept an out-and-out socialist. Remember, Obama is a transitional stage. He's leading us to socialism as a nation, and that's what the word Nazi means, National Socialism. And so Bernie would be the next probe. How far have we conditioned this upcoming generation, the 20-something and 30-somethings, to accept outright socialism? And they're very, very pleased that so many people are accepting Bernie because he is a challenge to the, quote, Democrat establishment, which is Hillary and the big bankers and that sort of thing. Well, Trump is the same thing. He represents the outsider. Now, I know Bernie's not really an outsider, but he's presenting himself as an outsider, an alternative to the Democratic establishment of their connection with, the Saudis and the big bankers and all that sort of stuff. So on the other side, you have an outsider, Donald Trump, coming in. But what you got to remember is Donald Trump only got into this race after having a talk with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is the one who urged him in there. And, of course, Donald Trump gets in there, and it seems that he tries to unnecessarily aggravate a lot of people, women and so on. For example, I don't know of